Joining us now, Illinois Congressman Raja Krishnamoorthi. He sits on both the Oversight and Intelligence Committees. Congressman, you've been a big proponent of following the money when it comes to Epstein. So how critical is Wexner on that front? And were you satisfied with his deposition, or do you still have more questions for him?
I think there are more questions than answers. I think one of the biggest facts with regard to Mr. Wexner is that he actually entrusted Jeffrey Epstein with his power of attorney. You don't just do that with anybody. You do that with somebody that you know extremely well and that knows you extremely well. And that's why his answers don't seem credible. And as was mentioned, he did visit Jeffrey Epstein's island. He had extensive business and property ties with Epstein. And so I'm not really sure who's conning who right now, but I don't find his answers very credible.
Congressman, it was that moment where he is describing himself almost as if he is the victim here who has been hoodwinked by Epstein. That definitely raised some eyebrows. There was another eyebrow-raising moment from that deposition in which he has an interesting interaction with his lawyer. Take a look at this.
But then all the things were inventoried. That wasn't work for me or Jeffrey. It was just regularly done. Answer not the question. Okay.
So, Congressman, does that sound legal advice there?
That seems like coaching the witness in legal parlance. I think that that's, not something that is going to be viewed very well by the committee, at least not by me. I think that Mr. Wexner has been coached, and I think that is, again, why so many people think there's a cover-up here. There's a cover-up of immense dimensions, and that's why, the survivors have not received a single measure of justice in over 20 years, since the time that they were young girls who were abused as part of this child sex trafficking ring. Just to remind your viewers, these then girls are now middle-aged women. They've come to us on Capitol Hill on multiple occasions. I've met with them for several hours, and their stories are so moving and specific. And I think it's stiffened the resolve of people like me and others to get to the bottom of what's happened, get all the files out, and bring accountability to those powerful men who've perpetrated these grotesque crimes and prevent this from ever happening again.
One of the questions that has emerged in recent weeks has been centered around Howard Lutnick and his relationship with Jeffrey Epstein, given the fact, based on what he had said publicly in interviews and then what he had testified before Congress, obviously those statements that he made publicly and privately, or I should say publicly in an interview and to Congress, were incongruent. I'm wondering if he is on your radar. Ro Khanna has called on Howard Lutnick to resign based on his responses. But what questions do you have about Howard Lutnick's relationship with Jeffrey Epstein?
Well, as you recall, he flat out denied having any ties with Jeffrey Epstein past a certain point, and yet it appears that's not correct. It is false. And so I think he has some explaining to do, and I know that, quite frankly, a number of others have a lot of explaining to do. I had a chance to review the unredacted files, and there are a lot of names in there of people who should be investigated, and quite frankly, those names should be publicized as well. I think that the number of redactions in the files don't make any sense. There are numerous people who I think are potential co-conspirators that have to be investigated, and we're not seeing action on those, not to mention the fact that there are millions of pages of files that have just not been disclosed at all in any form.
We actually have the sound, I believe, of Howard Lutnick, the Commerce Secretary, making that denial. Can we play that?
My wife and I decided that I will never be in the room with that disgusting person ever again.
Did you, in fact, make the visit to Jeffrey Epstein's private island?
We had lunch on the island. That is true, for an hour, and we left with all of my children, with my nannies and my wife, all together. We were on family vacation. We were not apart. To suggest there was anything untoward about that in 2012, I don't recall why we did it, but
Mr. Secretary.
I also want to clarify that he is not the only member of the cabinet who apparently palled around with Jeffrey Epstein. RFK Jr. appears in the files and has said, well, everybody was hanging out with Jeffrey Epstein, so what's the big deal? We have, I believe, the Secretary of the Navy who appears in the files as being a bosom buddy of Mr. Epstein. I guess I'm wondering, is this a problem throughout the administration? And if it is, what is the correct remedy here, given that the Department of Justice does not seem keen on doing any further investigations? And it seems like those who have been called before your committee have not been particularly cooperative.
Well, I think, first of all, we need to get all the files out, because I think there's more in there that could potentially implicate others and give more color as to exactly people's relationship to Epstein. I got to tell you, those emails that I've seen, the unredacted emails, are just flat out weird. And I have a lot of questions about, you know, what's really going on in that correspondence. In terms of the remedy, I think first we need the transparency. But in addition to the transparency, I think that people are going to need to resign. People are going to need to fess up. If they were somehow implicated in this horrible sex trafficking ring, they're going to have to answer for that as well. You know, unfortunately, in Britain and the UK, we're seeing more moves to hold people accountable than we are here. And that is deeply distressing, as the survivors have eloquently described as well.
Congressman, before you go, I just want to ask you about a separate issue. You are part of a bipartisan effort demanding that HHS use the funds that Congress has appropriated to restore the LGBTQ plus Youth 988 crisis services line. Have you made any headway? And can you talk just briefly about the importance of that crisis hotline?
Well, first of all, it's called the Press 3 function for the National Suicide Hotline. And that function was actually instituted under the first Trump administration on a bipartisan basis for LGBTQ folks who were going through distress and needed assistance. It turns out that millions of calls and texts were made. Tens of thousands of people have been saved or helped through that hotline. It was then basically defunded under a anti-DEI effort by the second Trump administration. And then again, I helped lead a bipartisan coalition of Republicans and Democrats to call for funding it. We successfully got that done just last week. And now we want the Trump administration to officially reinstitute the Press 3 function, actually spend the money that we have appropriated, because at the end of the day, I mean, these are people's lives, and every life should be taken seriously. And I hope and pray that the Trump administration does that. We're going to hold their feet to the fire now that we've funded it, and that's going to be part of my oversight duties.
Congressman Raja Krishnamoorthi, thank you so much for your time and for standing up for youth who may be in crisis.
Thank you.
Up next,